Hello and welcome to Read All About It, the podcast where people talk about their favourite and not so favourite books. Join me, Paul Cuddihy, as I take each guest on the literary journey of their life, from their most cherished childhood read and a book they'd recommend to anyone, to the book they couldn't be paid to read again, and much more in between. So listen, enjoy, subscribe and spread the word about the Read All About It podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Read All About It podcast with me, Paul Cuddihy, and I'm delighted to be joined this time by Paul Lyons, who is a railway historian. Paul's enjoyed a varied career that has taken him from Ministry of Defence police officer, investment broker and manager of both Euston and King's Cross railway stations in London. On returning to Scotland, he worked in train planning. He wrote the Scottish timetable one year, while he's also been the duty manager at Glasgow Central Station and also the Central Station announcer. In recent years, he has become the historian at Central Station, and he has established a tour of the station that has been the number one thing to do in Glasgow for a number of years. And having been on the tour, I can testify that it is an experience not to miss. He also sports the most majestic of beards, which unfortunately you can't appreciate on this audio podcast. Well, it's fair to say he's also a man for the Celtic. Paul, thanks for joining us on the Read All About It podcast.
My great pleasure to be here again, Paul, as ever.
I mentioned there, obviously, quite a lot of your working career has been involved in railways, and you're now the historian at Central. And I know for anybody who's listening just now and has been on this tour, it is a fantastic experience. Anybody who hasn't been on, I can't recommend it highly enough, because you're within a working station, but you're also, it's not just the history of railways and the station, but the city itself.
That's very kind, Paul, to say that. The reaction to the tours has been absolutely phenomenal. It's become more of a social history tour of Glasgow and Scotland itself. It's great on a daily basis to meet so many varied and different people, and they bring their stories to me, and I can then transpose them to be passed on, hopefully through generations for years to come. I think it's been a great addition to the city. That's nearly 75,000 people I've been through. I think I've done just over 5,000 tours, and everyone is different because the experiences, and people that they bring to the party, to the tour as well.
Because one of the good things I always like about the tour, it's obviously very much about the history, but you're very good at using modern means of communication, social media, in terms of letting people know who's been on the tour, some of the great stories that you hear, maybe people who have worked in the railways in the past, but also promoting it.
I think social media, gets a bad name, gets a bad press, and has done greatly recently. But there's so many benefits from social media, and that's something that when I started out in the tours, I thought I'll go for this to see if this garners more interest in the tours. And you're right, it's worked. It's been very successful. We live in a media-driven time now. People want to see photographs of who's been in the tour and the rest, and it's been great. It's turned out absolutely great.
And is it ultimately your interest in history has driven you into this position that you've kind of created for yourself over the last few years?
Well, to be honest, Paul, as my wife will testify, I'm not the most organised person in the world, and I came up with this idea many years ago, and I get great support from the then station manager at the time, a hell of a nice guy called Ross Moran. Ross left the railway, but thankfully he's come back to ourselves recently there. As I say, great support from him, and I never set out with a plan, to be honest. People still ask me to this day in the tours, did you have this great cultivated formation of a plan? And to be honest, no. I came down those stairs 6 years ago, started talking, I've never stopped talking since. And it really incorporated the things that I was interested in, and I was surprised that the wider audience, that people actually tuned into this as well. My great love of the history of Glasgow, the history of Scotland, the history of people coming across during the famine to Scotland itself. My distant relatives were involved in that. The social political things that have transpired in Glaswegian and Scottish history throughout the years, and it was a case of pulling all these things together. And amazingly enough, I met so many people that could identify with this.
Well, today I'm going to take you on your journey of your literary life. I have to say at the outset that you've set a new benchmark for guests, because you did turn up with some fantastic caramel shortcake. So I think if anybody who is going to come on this podcast, you've now you've set the challenge for future guests.
I'm just a big crawler. That's what it is.
We start with the first question, which is your favourite book from childhood. I mean, can I just say I'm gutted it wasn't The Railway Children that you chose?
And no, I'm not all Paul. The Railway Children wasn't written then.
So what the book that you have chose, and you said it was when you were younger, it was your mum had read you some Oscar Wilde.
Yes, my mother's influence has been a huge influence on myself, on my life growing up. My mother had a book, Oscar Wilde's Poems and Prose, which is broken up into various different small stories about particular subjects. You know, they've got various different names. The artist, the doer of good, the disciple, the master. Oscar Wilde was a genius. Oscar Wilde was a superstar of his day. He had a tragic life, alas, and I think that's well documented in history. But Oscar's stories, the imagery that's in the stories, you know, they were vivid. And I think it's, you know, I've been thinking about this interview for the past couple of days, and I think books are so important because they shape your life. They shape the way you're going to become as a person. And I could see in Oscar's imagery that it's something I think I've continued for the rest of my life. You know, I love these plays. I love the stories that's in them. You know, they're very, very heartrending, very touching. The more I found out about Oscar Wilde as time went on, you could see through his work, it was a reflection of his tragic life as well. But such an amazing man. I would love to have met Oscar Wilde. The only downside to him was that I discovered a wee while ago that he had an extremely irritating way of speaking. And I discovered that it was an undulating way of speaking that Oscar Wilde had, and he can be compared to Robert Peston. You know the way Robert Peston speaks, that he'll go from up very high to down very low, and he'll shout very like this. And
so Alistair Gray was like that as well.
That's right, and I understand Oscar was he spoke like that as well. Just there's a wee stranger side there.
Because some people would remember, for example, things like The Happy Prince and The Selfish Giant. But those stories in that book that you're talking about, were those stories specifically for children, or was it just something you
well,
mum
they
read?
were in that.
Right,
they were in that book. Because it was this big weighty tome my mother had, and I think I've still got it in the house, and it had all the various plays in it, but this was at the back, and because they were so much shorter, that's what she would read to me, I think, and that kept my attention at an early age. But even then I could see the beauty and the imagery that was in these stories, and as I say, maybe it's a strange thing to discuss at such an early age, but I think I've had a great influence from my mother throughout the years. You know, my mother was a draftswoman in a professional life, and then when she retired, she became an artist, and she's an excellent artist. But as well as that, you know, there was the poetry side of things. My father was a welder in the Clyde, and the two of them were chalk and cheese, you know. It doesn't take away for anything my dad ever done, but he was never interested in the things that, you know, my mother was interested in. So the biggest influence came from her. And even to this day, when I go back over Oscar Wilde's work, you can still see the incredible beauty that's in it.
Because there's something, and I think a lot of people, when you talk to them about books, particularly in childhood, it's maybe something that their parents read. And were you conscious of that as well, in terms of either passing those stories on or wanting to read to your daughter?
Yes, and I think it's a chain, it's a progression, isn't it? I have passed some of these stories on to my daughter as well, and she's been really influenced by them, I think. It's so important to get at such an early stage with kids. You know, you can make such an influence in a child's life, and you do make such an influence as time goes on, that you have to do it the right way to begin with, you know. And, you know, I could forever thanking my mother for that through her influence, that's what made me the person I am today. And you never lose your love for these early books. You know, I listened to that podcast the other day there with the chap that was on, he was talking about Kidnapped, and that's something that stuck with him for the rest of his days as well. So it's so important, I think. And
your parents moved back to Ireland in recent years, and I know you spoke about the fact that your mum is an artist, and you do sometimes post some of the pictures that she has done, and they are absolutely excellent pictures.
I think it wasn't a bohemian upbringing, you know, but I could see that, you know, the talent was there, my mother, and, you know, some people listening to this might think, oh God, it was Enid Blyton I was brought up by. No Oscar Wilde, but even so, it's what a great influence it's been.
And I suppose it's the exciting thing when you're reading, if you're first introduced to Oscar Wilde as a child when your mum's reading his stories to you, then at a certain point she maybe takes a step back and allows you then to discover it yourself, reading the books and reading the plays and whatever else on your own.
You're right, it's a starting point, isn't it? And then you go from there, and then I found out, you know, the man that he was, and the life that he had, and the difficulties in his life, and wrongly imprisoned, you know, and absolute persecution the man had. But you're right, it goes from there. It's a starting point, a foundation, you know.
And that's from that starting point we then move on to kind of formative years, so you're maybe starting to form your own tastes in books, and it's quite I suppose people at first glance would, when they hear this choice from your formative years, quite a heavy tome.
Well, Voltaire's Candide, you know, I've actually brought it with me today. I bought this when I was 14, and I kept this copy for all the different places that I've been in my life, and different houses I've lived in, events I've had, and there it is, the tattered.
I like the fact that you know that I think all of us have. It might just be a handful of books. It might just be one book that it's not just the book and the story that takes you back, but actually as a physical product, you just want to keep it because holding that book will take you back to maybe just from when you were 14 and when you bought this book.
I love books. I've got a great collection of books now. I've got a great library in the house. I've bought a huge amount of books over the past couple of years. You're right, it's a physical thing, Paul. You know, it's like going back to, as a comparison with music. I loved albums. You know, I loved the gatefold sleeves with the big pictures on the front.
Yeah.
You could take them out, you could read the...
Because there's a renaissance in vinyl records now.
Aye, my daughter's got vinyl, and I love that, and it's lost now, but you're right, it's the physical thing of books. Books are lovely things to have, you know. It's one of my great obsessions, is books, and I'm so glad that I kept that. You know, it'd been with me, as I say, through many different things, different houses I lived in through the past 30 odd, near 40 years. It sounds like an unusual choice, but
for anybody who's not read it, it's still
the funniest book I've ever read in my life. Right. You know, for a book that was written, I think it was in the 1780s, that it's still laugh out loud material. It's fundamentally a story about a man that will never lose the will to keep going. You know, and it's written in such a beautiful way. Voltaire was a fascinating man. He was a great wit of his time. He was persecuted throughout history, but still seen as one of the great writers of all time. And the story is simply that this man in the book suffers so many different trials and tribulations, but he still will always look to the positive side of things. And I think that's a great philosophy to have in life, and I still have this to this day.
I've said this again on the podcast before, that one of the things I really love about it is the fact that effectively I'm getting book recommendations. Mm-hmm. So when I spoke to Chris Dole on Don Quixote, I hadn't read that, so I've read that, read Far From the Madding Crowd in the back of someone else, and then right away I'm thinking, well, I'm going to have to read this because I haven't read this either. And it's just, you know, it's a never ending, you know, there's so many books in the world that you've never read, but it's great when somebody almost gives you another treasure.
I think it's astounding, you're right, it opens another avenue when somebody says to you, you know, read this, and you immerse yourself in a book. That book for me was absolutely incredible and still is to this day, and I'll be leaving that with you so you can read it.
It's still pretty good, Nick.
It's no bad.
I don't know, it's like leaving a family heirloom. That's a lot of pressure.
No, you can have it, Paul, you can have it.
I tell you one thing, when you were saying there about, you know, you've got a lot of books, and it's one thing I've got, I just love, I'm not sure sometimes if I love buying books as much as I love reading them, and at one point, my wife used to smoke. Thankfully, she gave up cigarettes a long time ago. But every now and again, I came in with books, or books would arrive, and she'd go, "Oh, not more books." And I used to always say, "Look, no one's ever died of passive reading."
I'm going to use that because I've got the exact same circumstances, Paul. That Amazon deliveries come on a regular basis, and I spent an absolute fortune on them. And I'm absolutely obsessed with this library I've got right now. You know, but the thing is, you've always got them. you know, and you can pass them on as time goes on. I think if you have a good balanced library as well, and I like to think I've got one like that. Now, Candide is, it's set in its time, set in the 1700s, but as I say, that if you cut straight to the chase, it's a man who's faced terrible adversity, and some of it is absolutely ludicrously funny, you know, which is, it's as if the book was written yesterday, but well worth a read.
That's what I find extraordinary sometimes when you, if you say if it's a book that's written in the 18th century, so you're reading something that's over 200 years old, but it still resonates with you, which I think is incredible. It's a testament to the skill of the author as well, but the fact that that's why a book like that endures.
I would love to have met some of these guys. You know, that you're right, they were writing books that are still relevant to this day, and what an intellect they must have had. What must have been like to be inside Voltaire's mind, you know, and the more you read about these guys and the more you find out about them, the more fascinating they become.
Well, certainly I'll take very good care of this book.
Sorry.
If we move on to your third choice, and that is now a book that you would recommend to anyone.
Well, this is one of my favourite books of all time. I think I've read this book about 4 or 5 times, and I started to read it again last night, and that's Roddy Doyle's A Star Called Henry. It's just so, it's hard to describe, it's so beautifully written. Roddy Doyle, as we know, is one of the most famous writers in Ireland, and I'd put him up there beside Shauna Casey and the rest. The book itself starts in the late 1800s. Henry Smart is the star, and he's born in grinding poverty in Dublin. And you know, Doyle was so descriptive in this. You know, the rats are in the house, and the mother has absolutely nothing at all. The book opens with them sitting on a pavement in this outside this Dublin tenement, and they're looking at the stars in the sky, and the stars in the sky that the mother's pointing out are the kids that she lost through childbirth, that died in absolute poverty. Now, Henry's life mirrors the most dramatic and the most important point in Irish history, I think. It goes through the Revolution of 1916, then the Civil War, 1921, and then it continues through that. Now, the thing that I really like about Henry is a survivor, but he's a chancer as well, you know, and he's got this Dublin humour about him. He ends up in the GPO during the 1916 Easter Rising. Henry's no interested in that. He's having sex with a woman down the stairs while this is all going on. Ultimately, it's a dramatic book. It's a sad book as well. But ultimately, Henry is used by just about everybody in his life. And he knows this, but he gets through it. He escapes that. Roddy Doyle, this was the first part of a trilogy. The second part was called Oh Play That Pretty Thing. And that's when Henry ends up he goes to New York and he works as a bouncer for Louis Armstrong. He then comes back from New York as an older man to Ireland, and ultimately the third one, The Dead Republic, is a wonderful book as well, because he gets involved in the peace treaties that came to place in the 90s in Ireland.
Well, do you know, it's interesting that when I saw you...
Have you read this?
Well, do you know, I have. I've read all 3 of them, and when I read A Star Called Henry, and I absolutely agree with you. I think it's a social history, it's brilliant. I think you're there, and the way Roddy Doyle describes that poverty, the whole city of Dublin, you know, the life that Henry leads, and he's a brilliant character. So I absolutely loved the book, and I've read that 2 or 3 times. I really struggled with the other 2 books. I found, and I don't know whether because I loved A Star Called Henry so much, I struggled with the second one when he was in America. I absolutely toiled with The Dead Republic.
I think it's interesting you saying that, Paul, that I was so disappointed with the second book. You're right, you went for this high, the first one. The second one I found very difficult. I never finished it, but I read the third one, and I was impressed with the third one solely because, from a personal point of view, I had a great interest in the film The Quiet Man.
Yeah.
You know, John Ford fascinated me, and when The Dead Republic starts, it's Henry's lying in the desert, and John Ford kicks him. No, he doesn't. He's doing a pee, isn't he? And he accidentally pees on him, and then it goes to there. So that sparked my interest a bit.
Yeah.
But although, as I say, Roddy Doyle is such a wonderful writer, that you're right. The second one was a great disappointment. I thought, what is this?
So the third one, I just felt there was so much crammed in. Can I tell you? I don't know if it's a sad story about John Ford, the quiet man, or just a sign that we're older, but maybe clever in the younger generation. We're having a conversation at work. And somebody was mentioning John Clarke, the Lisbon Lion. His favourite film of all time is The Quiet Man. So somebody hadn't heard of The Quiet Man, so I'm saying it's a fantastic film. It's an incredible film. You need to watch it. John Wayne goes back to Ireland, and one of the young guys said, "Is John Wayne a real person?" And we all looked, and he went, "I thought he was just a character that Clint Eastwood had played."
All right.
And it was like, right, he's not in our quiz team. That's it's very sad. But I must admit, that's what intrigued me, and I wanted to like The Dead Republic, but I just felt it just seemed to race through a whole period of time that I could never quite keep up with it.
Do you think, Paul, we were spoiled after the first book? That maybe that was his zenith?
I don't, because I always think, I'm such a big fan of Roddy Doyle, and most of the stuff, and even stuff that he's written subsequently,
the van,
I just love.
As I say, I keep coming back to Star Called Henry again. It'd be a fantastic film. It really would, and especially in the light of the 100 years anniversary of the Easter Rising. Henry, for me, the thing that really surprised me was that I'd spent years studying Irish history, and I looked at these great heroes of the Revolution, and it was so strikingly shocking to see him talking about them in venerated tones, just treating them as the men they actually were. I found that really engaging and funny. For me, James Connolly was always the outstanding participant in the Easter Rising. Connolly's politics, being a socialist, and Henry was a socialist as well. He had no time for what he perceived as the upper class revolutionaries that had no interest in him. He was always there to do the dirty work for somebody else, for Michael Collins, but he was never good enough to sign the proclamation because he was told he was too old. Henry wanted to insert the important things from his particular life, looking after women, rights for women, and these things were eroded. And when you look in on Irish history, that's exactly what did happen. I think Roddy Doyle was influenced by that when he was writing the book in the 90s. He said in the book, what did it matter in the end? We replaced one flag with another. The Dublin poor were still the Dublin poor.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what the elite had thought they'd conquered through the revolution. So thought-provoking stuff, most definitely.
Well, we can certainly both agree that A Star Called Henry by Roddy Doyle is a book that you should certainly read. You're listening to the Read All About It podcast with me, Paul Cuddihy, and my guest, the railway historian, Paul Lyons. And we're on to the fourth question, and it's a book that you couldn't be paid to read again. And I know that this is one that people approach with different degrees of difficulty, and I know that you, given the fact you can appreciate what goes into writing a book, that you weren't keen to name and shame anyone.
I did. I'd thought about this recently, Paul, and I've started to write a book about the history of Central and my experiences in Central tied into this. And I know you, as an author as well, that greatly appreciate how difficult it is to write a book. And I think books are subjective. One day you could look at a book and think, oh, this is good, and you could start on it, and then the other day, depending on your particular mood, it might put you off. Art is subjective. You look at a picture of, say, anybody, Klimt or Paul Klee or somebody like that, you might think it's wonderful, I might think it's absolute dross. So I would never be arrogant enough to, in my book, to decry somebody who'd spent maybe a year, 2 years, maybe more years sitting writing a book, and then just to be glib and dismissive and say, it's rubbish.
Yeah.
I would hate for somebody to hear that about their actual works.
It was funny because when Professor Willie Maley, when he was on the podcast, and he chose, and his wife said to him, if you're going for that category, make sure that the author's dead. So he chose a book from the 19th century.
I never thought of that.
But the other thing is, in terms of as a reader, and again, people seem to fall into two camps when they're reading a book that they don't like. Some people persevere with it because once they've started, they want to finish. And I'm of the other camp where if I'm not enjoying a book, I just put it down. I might go back to it later, but I'll just go on to something else because there's too many books out there to read.
That's the same myself. If I'm disappointed, I'll just say, right, call it quits. Life's too short to, drag yourself through another thing that you're not enjoying. And you're right, there are so many other books out there that are far more interesting, so you just say enough's enough. Because
that's why I wonder as well sometimes with that question then, because books that I don't like don't make the same impression on me because by and large I don't finish them. So that it's books that I finish, at the very least I thought that was okay. If not, I might absolutely love a book. So it's generally quite a positive experience, and the occasional one where you do kind of stick with it and it's a bit of a slog. At various times it's a real dilemma, do I give this up?
See, I don't read much fiction, Paul, to be honest. My library in the house collection is mostly historical stuff, history of Scotland, history of so many varied things, lots of factual stuff, biographies. John Muir, I've got quite a lot of books about him, and he's written himself, the famous conservationist that came from Scotland, started the Yosemite National Park, a man way ahead of his time. So most of my collection is mostly factual, historical stuff, and some fiction. Umberto Eco, I loved his stuff. He was an absolutely fantastic writer. He reminded me of Voltaire quite a lot as well.
Because I read the Name of the Rose is one of my favourite books, and when I put a wee podcast extra and it was recommending books, and one of them, The Name of the Rose, I always felt you had to read to about page 100. You had to stick with it for the first few pages, but see, once you got past that, it was what an experience as a reader. I actually quite liked the Sean Connery film as well, to be fair.
Oh, it was good. Good.
But as a book, I think it's absolutely stunning. Well, that takes us on to the book you're currently reading, and it's a book called The Last Crusade by Nigel Cliff.
Yep. As I mentioned there, I've got a great collection of historical books. I'm fascinated by the Crusades, by the Muslim world at that time as well, and the explorers, the men that opened up these various different routes to and from, to the Silk Road and things like that. I'd love to get inside. I try to get inside the mind of these explorers. The book itself is about Vasco da Gama. He had a fascinating life. He lived in the 1490s. The 1490s was such a profoundly influential period in history that we still suffer from the terrible things that happened at that time. 1492, Columbus sailed the blue, as we know. He brought pestilence and disease from the old world to the new. He was an astounding navigator, fascinating man, but even so, I don't think he realised the repercussions that it would cause on the new world. In saying that, I'm still fascinated by the fact that these men were so driven to go and explore. What Da Gama done, what Magellan done, that far outstrips what we done as modern men and women going to the moon in 1969. Could you imagine getting a team of people together? You're going on this expedition across to the other side of the world. You might never come back. Columbus went away for 9 years at one point. Fascinating to see how human endeavour and resilience can be pushed to that extent. Da Gama lived in, as I say, difficult times. This was the time of the Fourth Crusade, the First Crusade at 12. I think we're suffering from the times of the Crusades still to this day. The Muslim world invented mathematics and so many other wonderful things. The Crusaders themselves trampled across history and destroyed so many things that the Muslim people had at that time. The Crusaders were driven by greed for land, for gold. It was never about God. You know, as I said, it resonates throughout history to this very day.
So am I right in saying that Vasco da Gama was the first European to reach India by sea?
It was, and he circumnavigated Africa as well. As I say, I'm only halfway through the book right now, but his problems then arose because of the circumstances of the time.
So is it written as a factual, is it a history book, or is it written as a novel? Or?
I'd say both. He's a wonderful writer.
Nigel Cliff.
I was fascinated by some of his stuff. He's written other ones about the Crusades and things like that as well. As I say, it seems a bit of a strange topic, but the Crusaders, it's fascinating. You know, these men were driven by violence, violence and greed. You know, the Pope at the time, it's the whole geopolitical situation at the time is so involved. The Pope at the time was Urban. Pope Urban made the proclamation that Claremont, I think it was, for everyone to take the cross against the Muslim hordes. But the same again, it was all double standards. There was no interest in bringing Christianity back to Jerusalem. It was all about a land grab and money. And to this day, I can fully sympathise and see that, you know, the Muslim people suffer from a long memory because they remember back to how they were subjugated.
I suppose that's the fascinating thing about history, that, you know, you're reading about something that's events that happened 500 years ago, but as you say, they resonate down through history.
1,000 years ago, you know. And we look at the conflict that there is in the world because of religion on both sides, from, you know, the Middle East back to here. And I don't know how it'll ever be resolved, but I'm sure some of these men set out with the best intentions in their hearts, but you know, when you look at the terrible atrocities that were committed, always in the name of God, the big famous church, the Hagia Sophia, which is actually bigger than the Vatican, it's got a bigger dome than the Vatican, and you read at the First Crusade that the Crusaders actually swept through, and the blood of the vanquished were actually up to their waists. You know, that you can fully understand, you know, how things turned out.
It's beyond comprehension, actually.
It is. As I say, you know, 1,000 years ago is such a long time. It's hard for us to try and relate to what men were like in those days. But then again, I suppose a man's heart, either good or bad, is the same. It doesn't matter what decade or what millennia they live in.
I was up at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery recently, and they've got like a whole collection of different artefacts of war,
the swords,
armoury, swords, and when you look back at some of these old swords, and you think, apart from the fact it would have taken great strength to wield them, but there's a real brutality in knowing that was getting put into another human being.
I think that's difficult to reconcile yourself with, but when you read, you know, the events of, like, you know, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and things like that, and the length of those swords, they must have been a hell of a size of men, very, very strong men as well. Different times, you know, as I continually say, it's difficult for us to try and put ourselves, modern men, into their positions, but I'm sure they weren't much different, you know. I think they were more intelligent, to be honest. I think people in the 1700s, round about then, you look at the great writers and philosophers, I think now, you know, they were far more intelligent than we are today. You know, I think there's been a dumbing down in society over the past few decades.
Clint Eastwood played John Wayne.
Especially him, aye. We must find out who he is.
I know, but I'm not naming and shaming. Also, just as a slight football aside, Vasco da Gama, is he the only explorer who has a football club named after him?
I think he is. I think so.
But it's actually interesting because they also have obviously a football club in Rio in Brazil, but it was actually Portuguese immigrants who obviously that's where he's from, so that was maybe their way of just connecting with the with their own
I think so, aye.
Although I think there might be a team called Columbus Crew in the MLS in the United States. So
there is.
Well, that started a new...
Let's see how many more football teams we can get at this, Paul.
You mentioned there just the fact that you're now putting pen to paper yourself. You're starting to tell the story of the station and obviously your relationship with that. And is that an enjoyable experience to be going through?
It is. It's difficult sometimes. That I'm sure you've found that yourself writing a book. You've got so much in your mind, and it's to try and get everything down. And some days you feel completely inspired and you've got tons of stories, and then the next day there's absolutely nothing. And I think that's what I've been experiencing recently. You know, you've got these massive swings from information, get it down right away, or it's going to be lost again.
And do you have a deadline that you're working to in terms of when you want to bring the book out?
To be honest, it's something I should have done years ago, and I never got around to it. But continually, people are saying to me on a daily basis, this should be in a book, that should be in a book. So finally, I've caved in, and I shall do it, this book.
The thing is, I mean, having been on your tour, I mean, the story of of Central Station and its relationship to the city is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you add in, I think like a lot of books, if you add in the personal and the fact you've had that connection with the city, obviously quite a lot of people might recognise the name and they'll maybe know the face from that brilliant documentary that they did. BBC did.
Well, we've done a second one of those as well.
That was really fascinating.
And that's coming on in the next couple of months, and it's been a great reaction to that as well. But the book itself, Paul, there are so many historical books written about Glasgow, written about the station. As I say, I'm interjecting this with my personal experiences of the railway, with some great times, some great laughs in the railway. You know, the humour has been absolutely fantastic. And I'm trying to put this in as well, you know. So hopefully it'll turn out quite well.
Look forward to reading that.
Give me another 10 years and I'll be finished it, right?
And then hopefully one day somebody on the podcast that will be a book they recommend to anyone.
That'd be nice.
Well, listen, Paul, thanks very much for joining us. And as I said right at the very start, you have set the benchmark for future guests in terms of what you bring as edible gifts for me.
A big craw of Lyons, that's me.
But thanks very much for being a guest on the Read All About
My
It podcast.
pleasure, Paul. My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Read All About It podcast, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. You can get in touch via Twitter at ReadAllAbout20, on Instagram at ReadAllAboutIt podcast, or you can send an email to readallaboutit@paulcudahy.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, subscribe, leave a review and spread the word. If you haven't enjoyed it, say nothing to anybody. But I do hope you can join me, Paul Cudahy, next time on the Read All About It podcast. And in the meantime, keep reading.